Regardless of where I go, people have an opinion about what I do. And I'm sure you find that as well. When I'm coming home from the airport, if I'm in a taxi, often people ask me what I was doing and where I was and what I work. And invariably I'll say that I work at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and then people will tell me what they think about nuclear power. And it's one of the things that I think is very interesting about this industry. It's very well known, very high profile, and people have a lot of opinions about it. And I would just remind you about something too that I think is interesting. If I could go back again to some of the slides that Ross had shown, and we didn't work this out ahead of time. Two of the slides that he showed, I believe, were iconic images of nuclear power plants. Domestically, certainly, the two slides that reference domestic facilities, both of those were of cooling towers, which of course is not uniquely a nuclear facility. But it's a very iconic image about what nuclear represents in this country. So one of the things that always reminds me when I see things like that is the degree to which there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation about nuclear power. So it's one of the things, quite frankly, that makes this such an important job and such an interesting job, is to try and continue to help people understand what it is that we do as an agency, what it is that you do in the industry, and how we continue to achieve those ideas of safety and security that are so important in the nuclear power industry. Now, I said I'd talk a little bit about what I do. And what I do is in many ways very simple. I deal with a lot of policy issues at the Commission, things involving nuclear safety, nuclear security, the right kinds of legal framework to have for ensuring safety and security with the use of nuclear materials, with the operation of nuclear power plants. And with a background in physics and someone who always had an interest in public policy, this is for me really a nice combination, a nice marrying of those two ideas. Before I got to the NRC, I had an opportunity to work on Capitol Hill. And there's probably no more exciting place to work, I think, in the United States, if you want to be involved in policy, than working in Capitol Hill. It's a very fascinating environment. You learn a lot about how people take very different views and bring those ideas together to come up with solutions that are important for the nation. And that was a very important lesson for me, because that's an idea that I've carried with me as I moved over to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I truly, thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to really contribute to the effort to make government work better for the American people. I think that's a profound responsibility, and it's really one of the important things that we have to do. But from a daily basis, the thing I really like are the field trips. And let me tell you a little bit about what I mean. One of the issues that I've really focused on a lot as a commissioner is fire protection. Now, I'm sure in a room like this, everybody gets very excited when I say those words. That's not always the case in other venues. This can be a rather dry subject, but it's a subject that's very important in the nuclear power industry. From a technical level, we know that fire is a significant contributor to core damage frequency. So it's something that's important, it's something we have to understand, but it's very, very complicated to deal with from a regulatory perspective, from the legal foundation that we have. And as I said, it can be a dry subject. Some of the things that I get to deal with are things like the proper interpretation and implementation of decades-old technical regulations. So that involves doing things like reviewing SECI papers to determine the best regulatory process to improve licensing compliance with 5048C of the Code of Federal Regulations, considering the use of enforcement discretion and voluntary compliance, determining whether or not we should allow exemptions, or whether we should continue with enforcement discretion and other approaches. So that's some of what I do. Not the most exciting stuff. The real reason I like fire protection is, as I said, for the field trips and the show and tell. Every now and then, when I've been dealing with too many of the regulatory processes and too many of the papers and too many of the staff requirements memorandum and all the infrastructure that we deal with as a regulator, I always ask for a briefing on fire protection, because we're doing a lot of research in that area. And invariably, one of the folks from our fire protection area, usually Mark Sally or some of the people that work with him, will come to my office and give me a briefing. And I really like to have Mark come, because Mark always brings stuff with him. He'll bring cables, he'll bring wires, he'll bring all kinds of things, and invariably those things have been burned. And what you get to see is you really get to see that nexus between the science and the technical work And what's happening to these cables when you take an experiment and you see how they behave in a fire environment, and then taking that and translating that into some kind of regulatory policy to help the people in the industry understand what kinds of steps they need to take to ensure the safe use of those materials. Now, it didn't stop there. One of the things that I also got to do was take a trip to the National Institute of Standards and Technology Lab. They have a facility just up the street from the NRC. And if you've never had the opportunity to see something like this, it's a fascinating experiment. What they did was they had some very sophisticated facilities. And those facilities allow them to burn things. And then whenever they burn them, they're able to take a lot of measurements. How much heat is released? What kind of combustion rate do they have for the material? How much oxidation do they have and what rate? And all those kinds of things. And I had an opportunity to go there once and visit them and talk to some of the scientists there because we're doing some research there through the NRC. And I didn't realize they were actually going to burn some stuff for me. But it was one of the more interesting things I've ever seen. They took it, it was something fairly simple. I think it was a chair or maybe just a bale of hay, and they set it on fire. And one of the things that you saw, for those of you who have any background in fire, you'll probably appreciate this. After a certain amount of time, you had a lot of smoke that developed. And perhaps your natural thinking about a fire, about any kind of situation like that, is you have a lot of mixing. There's smoke everywhere, and it just kind of consumes the entire space. Well, one of the things we know about how fires develop is that you get a very nice two-layer effect, where you have the smoke above, and below you have clear air. It's very hot down there. But it's a very, very distinct line. And in this experiment, it's a very simple experiment that they did, just burning this simple object, within a short period of time, this two-layer effect had developed. And it's quite dramatic to see it. You have this impression with all this activity and with the heat and with the fire and the flames that there's going to be all this mixing, but it's actually not that way. It's a very, very simple clear air and then smoke at the top. Now, of course, that's what we always learn when we're kids, right? You'll learn in elementary school, and they always say you learn everything you need to know in elementary school or kindergarten, and you're always taught in the event of a fire you want to get down on the floor and you want to get low. Well, here was an opportunity to actually see that. Now, why does that matter for a nuclear regulator? Well, it matters because one of the things that we're trying to do is understand how we can respond and deal with fires. And that involves a lot of modeling. But if you can take a model and you only have to really understand, well, what layer, at what level, and what height is that smoke layer going to be, it makes for a much simpler model. So one of the things that we're trying to do right now with our new fire protection regulations is understand when we can make that kind of assumption. When is that applicable in a nuclear power plant? So there's a lot of things that we do. And